I can't remember my father, Jenkin William James, at all. He died when I was very young, leaving 4 children. But I knew from my earliest childhood that he was a very brave man who had gone to prison for his beliefs. He was born in Pontrydyfen near Port Talbot in 1893. His father was a coal miner, and my father was the eldest of 7 children, so not a lot of money. He was 21 when the First World War started. He got his science degree a month before the war broke out. I think he then went on to get a teaching diploma and began to look for work. He was a young man who went to chapel regularly, and this would include going to Sunday school. He followed Jesus' teaching. In the Bible it says, "Thou shalt not kill," and Jesus teaches, "Love your enemies." To him, this meant that he shouldn't go into the army, as the purpose of the army was to kill as many soldiers on the other side as possible. But in 1916 came conscription. The army was short of men to fight in the trenches in France, and so a law was passed which said that every man between the ages of 18 and 41 had to go into the army if they were called up. On August the 23rd in 1916, my father had to go to an army medical on the train to Swansea. He wasn't very fit. He was category B1. If he'd been category A, he would have been called up immediately, more or less. But in the autumn of 1917, the call came to go into the army, and the decision came too, that he'd refused military service on the basis of what Jesus said in the Bible. He could have gone down the mine to avoid military service, but by doing that, he knew that he would be helping the war effort. Coal helped to make armaments, and he wouldn't be taking a stand against fighting either. He must have gone along when he was called up and told the soldiers there that he refused to fight, and was arrested at once. This meant prison, and he was taken to London, to Wormwood Scrubs prison. He was in solitary confinement for a month, in a cell by himself for over 23 hours a day, with nothing to do except think. That was where he first met Quakers. There were many young Quakers in prison for the same reason. His minister in Pontrydyfen wrote a letter on the 6th of November 1917 to support his case as a conscientious objector. On the 7th of November, he was sent a letter by the Central Tribunal, that is, the people who decided whether the men who refused to fight really believed what they said because of their religious or moral principles, or whether they were lying in order to get out of fighting. The letter tells him he will be tried by the tribunal shortly. After the tribunal, he was moved to Dartmoor, to the prison at Princeton. There he had to break a certain amount of stones each day as punishment. My mother told us when we were children that he found the work too much for him physically, but that another prisoner, known as Mick the Murderer, helped him to complete his quota, and in return my father taught maths to Mick. I don't think Mick was really a murderer. He'd have been hanged if he were, but as a small child I accepted it as literally true. The lesson we learnt as children from this was there is that of God in everyone, that is, there is goodness to be found. My mother explained that my father wouldn't have survived the hard work of stone breaking without Mick's help, and therefore our very existence as children depended on the kindness of a murderer. My father was freed from prison on conditions in January 1919. That's nearly 3 months after the end of the war. His health was even poorer by then, but he was sent to work in the colliery in Pontrydyfen. He wasn't allowed to work anywhere else until he received a letter written on the 14th of June 1919, which says he is free to work anywhere. As someone who had been in prison, he felt he wasn't accepted in his own community. He could have been a coal miner if he wanted to avoid fighting, ran the thinking, and of course he was still alive, and others of his age had died in the trenches. And anyway, we were a respectable family, and being in prison wasn't respectable at all. He found it very hard to get a job as a teacher. He had been in jail, and just the same today, once you've been in jail, getting a job can be really difficult. Schools were short of teachers, but they wouldn't even interview him when he wrote he had been in prison in his letters of application. His chapel in Pontrydyfen supported him. They gave him a Bible in December 1919. I know he was very well respected in the town. As a child and over the years, his former pupils have spoken to me about him, and he was an exceptionally good teacher who lived what he believed, was completely honest, worked hard in his community and helped people.